CEO's daughter went undercover as intern, then fired all scumbag managers on the spot. The letter lay on Victoria Edwards' desk like an accusation, its edges catching the morning light that filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows 43 stories above the city. She hadn't opened it yet, couldn't really. 23 years had passed since she'd last seen her father's careful handwriting, and now it sat among quarterly reports and acquisition contracts like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. If you are ready to enjoy the story, make sure you subscribe, like, share, and comment below where you are watching from. Her fingers traced the envelope's edge without lifting it. Thomas Edwards was written in the corner, followed by an address she didn't recognize in a suburb that might as well have been another planet from her penthouse office. The Edwards Global Technologies logo gleamed from every surface around her: crystal paperweights, platinum letter openers, even the coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. $8 billion of empire, and yet this single piece of paper made her feel 8 years old again, waiting by a window for someone who never came home. "Ms. Edwards." Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board meeting has been moved to 3 p.m. "Fine." Her voice came out clipped, professional. It was the only voice she'd used for so long that sometimes she wondered if she remembered any other way to speak. Victoria stood, her Louboutin heels clicking against Italian marble as she moved to the window. The city sprawled below her like a circuit board, all clean lines and calculated angles. She'd built this view, earned every inch of it through 16-hour days and deals that would make lesser executives weep. Yet standing here, surrounded by the trappings of absolute success, she felt nothing but the familiar hollow ache that had lived in her chest since childhood. The letter seemed to pulse behind her, demanding attention she wasn't ready to give. 43 floors below, David Chen clutched his employee badge like a lifeline as he stepped through the gleaming lobby of Edwards Global Technologies. 22 years old and fresh from State University with a marketing degree and hopes bigger than his student loan debt, he'd dreamed of this moment for months. The lobby's soaring ceilings and marble columns made him feel impossibly small, but he straightened his shoulders and approached the reception desk. "First day." The security guard's smile was kind, paternal. His name tag read Roberto, 15 years of service. "Is it that obvious?" David's laugh came out higher than intended. "You get a look in your eyes, like Christmas morning and a root canal all rolled into one." Roberto handed him a temporary badge. "Don't worry, kid. The nervousness fades. Usually." The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal. David checked his reflection in the polished doors, tie straight, hair combed, the lucky pen his sister had given him clipped to his shirt pocket. "You've got this," he told himself, the same words he'd whispered before every exam, every interview, every moment when the weight of being the first in his family to graduate college threatened to crush him. The marketing department buzzed with the controlled chaos of Monday morning urgency. David found himself assigned to a cubicle that had seen better decades. The fabric walls were faded, the desk surface scarred with ring stains from countless coffee cups. But it was his, and that made it beautiful. "You must be the new intern." The voice belonged to a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and silver streaks threading through her black hair. She extended a hand. "Maria Gonzalez. I've been here long enough to remember when this place had actual plants instead of these plastic monstrosities." David shook her hand gratefully. "David Chen. And thank you for—" "Richards. Where the hell is that Peterson report?" The bellow came from a corner office where a man in an expensive suit was visible through glass walls, his face red with what appeared to be perpetual anger. Several employees hunched lower in their cubicles, as if trying to become invisible. Maria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's Manager Richards. Word of advice, stay off his radar until you learn the lay of the land." "Is he always so?" David searched for a diplomatic word. "Charming." Maria's voice was dry. "Oh, you haven't seen anything yet." Richards believes fear is the most effective motivator. Unfortunately, upper management seems to agree with him. As if summoned by their conversation, Richards emerged from his office, his eyes scanning the department like a predator seeking weakness. His gaze landed on David, and something predatory flickered across his features. "Fresh meat," he said, loud enough for half the department to hear. "Let's see how long this one lasts." David felt heat rise in his cheeks but forced himself to remain silent. Maria placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a warning and a comfort all at once. "The Peterson report, Richards," a timid voice called from across the room. "It's Manager Richards to you, Harrison. And if you'd done your job properly in the first place, we wouldn't need Peterson's cleanup crew." Richards' voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for his behavior. David watched the exchange with growing unease. This wasn't the collaborative, innovative environment he'd imagined. The air itself seemed thick with tension, everyone walking on eggshells around a man who seemed to take genuine pleasure in others' discomfort. Meanwhile, 43 floors above, Victoria finally picked up her father's letter. Her hands trembled, a weakness she couldn't afford to show in the boardroom, but couldn't seem to control in this moment of solitude. The envelope tore with a whisper, revealing 2 sheets of paper covered in the careful script she'd once known by heart. "My dearest Victoria, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to seek it. I'm writing because I'm dying, and there are things you deserve to know. Not excuses, I have none that matter. Just truths I should have given you long ago. The gambling, the debts, the nights I couldn't come home because I was ashamed of what I'd become. None of that was your fault, though I know my leaving made you feel otherwise. I thought disappearing would hurt less than watching you see me fail. I was wrong about that, as I was wrong about so many things. I've followed your success from afar. Your mother, God rest her soul, used to send me newspaper clippings, pictures from business magazines. She was so proud, even after everything. She never stopped believing you'd change the world. I'm proud too, though I know I forfeited the right to say so. But Victoria, I hope in building your empire, you haven't forgotten to build a life. Success without connection is just an elaborate way of hiding from the world. I should have taught you that. I should have taught you many things. If you find it in your heart to see me, I'm at the address below. If not, I understand. Either way, know that leaving you was the greatest mistake of my life, and loving you, even from this distance, has been my one redeeming grace. Your father, Thomas." Victoria's vision blurred. She set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter, and walked to her private bathroom. In the mirror, she looked the same, perfectly styled auburn hair, flawless makeup, the kind of beauty that came from the best money could buy. But her eyes looked hollow, haunted by a sadness she'd spent decades trying to outrun. Success without connection is just an elaborate way of hiding from the world. The words echoed in her mind as she returned to her desk. Through her window, she could see into other office buildings, catch glimpses of people living their lives, sharing coffee, laughing at desks, existing in the messy, complicated world of human connection she'd convinced herself she didn't need. For the first time in years, Victoria Edwards wondered if she'd been wrong about a great many things. What do you think drives someone to build walls around their heart? Have you ever had a moment where a simple letter or message made you question everything about the life you'd built? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest cracks in our armor. 3 weeks later, Victoria Edwards stood in the employee parking garage at 7:30 a.m., staring at her reflection in a Honda Civic's window. The woman looking back at her was almost unrecognizable. No designer suit, no perfectly styled hair, no armor of expensive accessories. Instead, she wore a simple black blazer from Target, her hair pulled back in a basic ponytail, minimal makeup that she'd applied with hands that shook from more than just caffeine. "Vicky Edwards," she whispered to herself, testing the name she'd chosen for her cover identity. Not Victoria, too close to her real name. Just Vicky, the marketing intern from State University, who'd graduated with decent grades and big dreams. The fake resume in her purse listed a modest background, a small apartment address, student loans that would take decades to pay off. All carefully constructed lies that felt more honest than the truth she'd been living. The badge Roberto handed her read temporary employee, marketing in red letters that might as well have been a scarlet letter. For someone who'd never needed to show ID to enter any building she owned, the simple act of scanning a badge felt like crossing into foreign territory. "First day jitters?" Roberto asked with the same paternal kindness she'd observed him show to David weeks ago. "Something like that." Victoria's voice came out softer than usual, missing the crisp authority that had commanded boardrooms for 20 years. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt different from this angle. Longer, more cramped, filled with the nervous energy of people who actually needed these jobs. Victoria caught fragments of conversation. Someone's sick child, another person's car repair bills, the low hum of financial worry that she'd never had to carry. For a moment, she felt like an intruder in their world. The marketing department looked different at ground level. From her executive floor, it had been a clean grid of efficiency metrics and productivity charts. Down here, she could see the worn fabric of cubicle walls, the flickering fluorescent light that cast everything in a sickly pallor, the coffee stains on carpet that hadn't been replaced in years. This was where her profits came from, not from sterile conference rooms, but from this maze of human hopes and fears. "You must be Vicky." Maria Gonzalez appeared at her elbow with a warm smile and a stack of orientation papers. "Welcome to the trenches. I'll be showing you the ropes." Victoria shook the offered hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in Maria's grip. "Thank you. I'm excited to be here." It wasn't entirely a lie. Beneath the anxiety and guilt, there was something that might have been excitement, the unfamiliar thrill of anonymity, of being judged on her actions rather than her bank account. "David," Maria called to the young man Victoria had been watching from afar. "Come meet your fellow intern." David Chun looked up from his computer with the eager expression of someone still new enough to find hope in Monday mornings. When he smiled at Victoria, it was without calculation or agenda, just the simple friendliness of a decent person meeting another decent person. "Vicky, right? Maria mentioned you'd be starting today." David stood and offered his hand. "David Chun. Fair warning, I'm still figuring out where the good coffee is hidden." "There is no good coffee," Maria laughed. "That's the first lesson of corporate survival. Lower your expectations for everything except the work itself." As Maria led her through orientation, Victoria found herself seeing her company through new eyes. The employee handbook she'd approved without reading was filled with policies that sounded reasonable in theory, but felt oppressive in practice. The break room she'd never visited was a windowless box with a microwave that looked older than David. The bathrooms were clean but institutional, nothing like the marble sanctuary of her executive washroom. "Here's your desk," Maria said, stopping at a cubicle that might have been David's twin. Same faded fabric, same ring-stained surface, same sense of making do with less. "I know it's not much, but it's yours. That's something, right?" Victoria stared at the small space that would be her world for the next few weeks. She'd spent more on individual pieces of art than this entire workstation probably cost. Yet there was something unexpectedly moving about it. The idea that this modest space represented someone's livelihood, their dreams, their chance to build something meaningful. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The morning passed in a blur of system passwords and project briefings. Victoria found herself partnered with David on a client presentation for a small regional business, the kind of account that barely registered on her usual radar, but represented someone's entire world. As David explained the client's needs with genuine enthusiasm, Victoria felt something stir in her chest that she couldn't quite name. "They're a family business," David was saying, his eyes bright with the passion that made him vulnerable in a place like this. 3 generations of making furniture by hand. They want to expand their online presence, but keep their authentic voice. It's actually a really beautiful story. Victoria watched his face as he spoke, seeing echoes of the young woman she'd once been, before cynicism and isolation had calcified around her heart like scar tissue. When had she stopped seeing businesses as stories and started seeing them only as numbers? Then Richards appeared. Manager Richards moved through the department like a storm system, his presence preceding him in the way people's shoulders tensed and conversations died. He was younger than Victoria, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that suggested he'd peaked in high school and had been trying to reclaim that power ever since. "Chun." His voice cut through the department's hum like a blade. "My office." "Now." David's face went pale, but he stood immediately. "Yes, sir." Manager Richards. Victoria watched through the glass walls as Richards closed his office door and began what could only be described as a verbal assault. Though she couldn't hear the words, David's body language told the story. The way his shoulders hunched, how his hands twisted together, the careful stillness of someone trying not to cry in public. "What's happening?" Victoria asked Maria, who had appeared beside her with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this movie too many times. The Peterson account presentation from last week. David did good work, but the client had some minor revision requests. Richards is making it David's fault instead of acknowledging that revisions are normal. Through the glass, they could see Richards jabbing his finger at papers on his desk, his face red with performative anger. David stood frozen, taking each verbal blow like a physical hit. "This is normal?" Victoria's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Unfortunately, Maria's tone was carefully neutral, but Victoria caught the flash of something fierce in her eyes. Richards believes public humiliation builds character. Or maybe he just enjoys it. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. Victoria felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. She'd approved Richards' promotion 2 years ago based on quarterly metrics and efficiency reports. On paper, he delivered results. She'd never bothered to ask how. The office door opened, and David emerged with the careful composure of someone holding themselves together by will alone. His face was flushed, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered the papers Richards had thrown at him. The entire department pretended not to notice, but Victoria could feel their collective flinch, their shared recognition of a humiliation that could be theirs next. "David." Richards' voice followed him across the department, carrying easily in the sudden silence. "Next time you waste a client's time with sloppy work, you'll be looking for a new job. Understood?" "Yes, Manager Richards." David's voice was barely audible. "I didn't hear you." "Yes, Manager Richards." Louder this time, carrying the forced volume of public shame. Richards smiled, not with pleasure at David's understanding, but with satisfaction at his pain. It was the smile of a predator who'd successfully cornered prey, and it made Victoria's skin crawl. As David returned to his desk, Victoria saw his hands shake as he tried to sort through the scattered papers. A coffee stain had appeared on his shirt, probably from spilled coffee during the confrontation, and he kept touching it self-consciously, as if trying to hide evidence of his humiliation. "Hey!" Victoria found herself standing beside his cubicle before she'd consciously decided to move. "Are you okay?" David looked up with eyes that were bright with unshed tears and forced a smile that broke her heart. "Fine. Just learning the ropes, you know." But he wasn't fine. Victoria could see it in the way he held himself, the careful breathing of someone fighting panic, the shame that seemed to radiate from his very pores. This wasn't just workplace correction, it was cruelty, pure and simple. And she was responsible for it. The client revision thing, that's totally normal, right? Victoria kept her voice gentle, conversational. "I mean, in my experience, clients always want to tweak things." "You've done client work before?" David's voice carried a note of hope, as if her understanding might somehow validate his experience. Victoria thought of the hundreds of presentations she'd sat through, the countless revisions she'd requested without thinking about the human cost. "Some. And trust me, what happened in there, that's not about you or your work. That's about him." David's shoulders loosened fractionally. "Thanks. I really need this job, you know. My sister has medical bills and my loans." He trailed off, probably realizing he was oversharing with someone he'd just met. But Victoria heard what he didn't say. She heard the weight of financial necessity, the fear that lived behind every paycheck, the knowledge that one man's cruelty could derail a life's trajectory. It was a fear she'd never known, and watching it play out in David's frightened eyes made her feel physically sick. "Your work was good," she said simply. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." For the rest of the day, Victoria found herself hyper-aware of the department's dynamics. She noticed how conversations stopped when Richards walked by, how people's laughter became forced and careful around him. She saw Maria quietly redistributing work to protect struggling employees, the way seasoned workers shielded newcomers from Richards' attention, the exhausted resignation in faces that should have been energetic and hopeful. This was her company. These were her employees. And this was happening every day while she sat in her ivory tower, concerned only with profit margins and stock prices. As the day ended and Victoria watched David pack up his things with movements still shaky from the morning's assault, she made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't just observe anymore. She wouldn't hide behind spreadsheets and distance herself from the human cost of her indifference. She was going to stay. She was going to learn. And then she was going to fix this, not as the untouchable CEO Victoria Edwards, but as Vicky, the intern who was finally beginning to understand what her empire had really been built on. Have you ever witnessed workplace bullying and wondered whether to speak up or stay silent? What do you think it takes for someone in power to truly see the impact of their decisions on others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Victoria sat in her BMW in the employee parking garage, the engine off, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The contrast between her morning as Vicky the intern and her current reality felt like emotional whiplash. In 20 minutes, she had a board meeting where she would discuss quarterly projections and efficiency metrics, the same numbers that Richards used to justify his reign of terror. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Board meeting moved to conference room A. Quarterly reports on your desk. Those quarterly reports would show that the marketing department had exceeded targets for 3 consecutive quarters under Richards' management. On paper, he was a success story. The human cost wasn't quantified anywhere, didn't appear in any spreadsheet. David's humiliation this morning wasn't a line item. Maria's exhausted vigilance wasn't a metric. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to rationalize what she'd witnessed. Maybe she was being overly sensitive. Maybe Richard's methods, while harsh, were effective. Maybe this was just how business worked at ground level, and her discomfort stemmed from inexperience with the real world rather than genuine wrongdoing. Maybe you're making excuses because facing the truth is harder than hiding from it. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her mind, words from his letter echoing with uncomfortable clarity. Success without connection is just an elaborate way of hiding from the world. She pulled out her phone and almost called her assistant to cancel the undercover operation. She could return to her office, review the quarterly reports, and convince herself that strong numbers justified harsh management. It would be easier, cleaner. She'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of emotional distance. But then she remembered David's face, the careful way he'd tried to hide his humiliation, the tremor in his voice when he'd mentioned his sister's medical bills. She thought about Maria's quiet protectiveness, the way she'd positioned herself between vulnerable employees and Richard's attention. These weren't abstract resources or efficiency variables. They were people with families, dreams, fears that kept them awake at night. "Damn it," Victoria whispered to her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked like a CEO again, perfect hair, flawless makeup, the armor of expensive clothing. But underneath, something had shifted. She couldn't unsee what she'd seen, couldn't unfeel the sick twist in her stomach when Richards had smiled at David's pain. 20 minutes later, she sat in conference room A, surrounded by leather chairs and quarterly projections, while 12 executives discussed the marketing department's performance with the clinical detachment of surgeons examining X-rays. "Richards continues to deliver exceptional results," CFO Margaret Walsh was saying, her voice crisp with approval. "Marketing efficiency is up 18% year over year, with client satisfaction scores holding steady." Victoria stared at the charts displaying Richard's success metrics. Somewhere in those numbers was David's humiliation, Maria's exhaustion, the careful way employees moved through the department like they were walking through a minefield. What about employee retention in marketing? Victoria heard herself ask. The question hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't the kind of thing they typically discussed in these meetings. HR handled personnel issues, leadership focused on results. "I believe it's within normal parameters," Walsh replied, shuffling through papers. "Some turnover is expected, particularly at entry level. Fresh blood keeps the department competitive." Fresh blood. As if the people leaving were being replaced by some renewable resource rather than carrying irreplaceable knowledge, relationships, and human potential out the door. "Perhaps we should look into employee satisfaction surveys for that department," Victoria suggested carefully. "Make sure we're not creating unnecessary turnover costs." "Of course," Walsh nodded, but Victoria could see the puzzled glance she exchanged with the VP of Operations. This wasn't like Victoria. She typically focused on big-picture strategy, not granular personnel concerns. For the rest of the meeting, Victoria found herself only half listening to discussions about market expansion and competitive positioning. Her mind kept drifting to the 15th floor, wondering what David was doing now, whether he was still shaken from the morning's confrontation. Was Richards finding new targets for his cruelty? Was Maria running interference, burning herself out trying to protect people who shouldn't need protection? When the meeting ended, Victoria walked slowly back to her office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her assistant had left the quarterly reports on her desk, along with a stack of documents requiring her signature. Normal business. The kind of high-level decision-making that had consumed her life for 2 decades. She tried to focus on a merger proposal, but the words blurred together. Instead, she found herself thinking about the employee handbook she'd given barely a glance when approving it. Had she ever read the section on workplace conduct? Did it even address psychological harassment, or was it just legal boilerplate designed to protect the company rather than its people? Victoria opened her laptop and navigated to the HR portal, something she'd never done in 20 years of running the company. The employee handbook was there, a 60-page document full of policies and procedures. She scrolled to the section on workplace behavior and found language so vague and corporate that it essentially said nothing at all. Edwards Global Technologies maintains a professional environment conducive to productivity and mutual respect. What did that even mean? Mutual respect according to whom? Productive for whom? The language was designed to sound protective while actually protecting no one except the company's legal department. Her phone rang. "Ms. Edwards? Your father called. He was hoping you might visit this evening." Victoria's throat constricted. She'd been avoiding the decision for 3 weeks, using work as an excuse to delay the emotional reckoning her father's letter had triggered. But after this morning, after seeing the human cost of her detachment, she couldn't hide anymore. "Tell him I'll be there at 7, she said. The suburban house where her father lived was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden and a porch swing that spoke of quiet contentment rather than ambition. Victoria sat in her car for 10 minutes before finding the courage to approach the front door. Thomas Edwards looked older than she'd expected, smaller somehow. The towering figure of her childhood memories had been reduced by illness and time to a fragile man whose eyes still held traces of the father who'd once lifted her onto his shoulders to see carnival rides. "Victoria." His voice cracked slightly on her name. "You came." They sat in his living room, surrounded by photographs she'd never seen. Pictures of her from newspapers and magazines, carefully clipped and preserved. Evidence that even in his absence, she'd been present in his thoughts. "I read your letter," she said finally. "About success without connection." He nodded slowly. "I've been watching your interviews, reading about your company. You've built something incredible, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have your mother's eyes, but they look so tired now. So lonely." Victoria felt tears threaten and forced them back. She'd spent 20 years perfecting emotional control. Business is demanding. Success requires sacrifice. Does it require sacrificing yourself? His question was gentle but pointed. "Because that's what I did, Victoria. I told myself that staying away was noble, that working obsessively to pay off debts was heroic. Really, I was just hiding from the hard work of being human." They talked until nearly midnight, about regret, about the ways people convince themselves that isolation is strength, about the difference between building something meaningful and building something impressive. When Victoria finally left, her father's words echoed in her mind. "The hardest thing about being powerful is remembering that other people are real." The next morning, Victoria returned to the 15th floor as Vicky the intern. She told herself she was gathering information, conducting due diligence before making any major changes. But the truth was more complicated. She was afraid. Afraid of what she might find, afraid of how complicit she'd been, afraid of the person she might have to become to fix what she'd broken. David was already at his desk when she arrived, working on the furniture company presentation with the determined focus of someone trying to prove their worth. The coffee stain from yesterday's humiliation had been scrubbed from his shirt, but Victoria could see the way he kept glancing toward Richard's office, the hypervigilance of prey that knew the predator was nearby. "How's the presentation coming?" Victoria asked, settling at the cubicle next to his. "Good, I think." David's voice carried forced optimism. "I've incorporated all the revision requests, double-checked the numbers, formatted everything exactly according to the style guide." Victoria looked at his work. It was meticulous, creative, exactly the kind of fresh thinking a family furniture business would need. But she could see the defensive armor in every perfectly aligned bullet point, the way he'd anticipated criticism in every design choice. "This is really good work," she said honestly. "The client is going to love the authenticity angle." David's smile was grateful but cautious, as if he didn't quite dare believe positive feedback anymore. Throughout the morning, Victoria watched the department's rhythm with new eyes. She saw how productivity actually decreased when Richards was visible, how people spent energy monitoring his mood rather than focusing on their work. She noticed the way conversations became stilted and artificial when he approached, how natural collaboration died under the weight of constant surveillance. This wasn't efficient management, it was organizational trauma. And she was responsible for every bit of it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't just failed to protect her employees from Richard's toxicity. She'd created the conditions that allowed it to flourish. Her distance, her focus on numbers over people, her willingness to ignore how results were achieved as long as they were achieved, all of it had built the foundation for this systematic cruelty. Victoria excused herself to the bathroom and stared at her reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. The woman looking back at her wore Target clothing and minimal makeup, but the eyes were still those of someone who'd spent 20 years hiding from the world. She'd thought coming down here would give her information she could use to make surgical changes from above. Instead, she was discovering that the problem wasn't Richard's. It was the culture she'd created, the values she'd modeled, the message she'd sent through her indifference. Fixing this would require more than firing one toxic manager. It would require rebuilding everything from the ground up, starting with herself. The question was whether she had the courage to tear down the walls she'd spent a lifetime building, even if it meant facing the full weight of her responsibility for the damage they'd caused. When you realize you've been part of a problem you didn't even know existed, how do you find the courage to change? Have you ever had to confront the gap between your intentions and your impact? Let us know in the comments. Sometimes the hardest person to face in the mirror is ourselves. The crisis came without warning on a Wednesday afternoon, wrapped in the mundane packaging of a broken HVAC system and a mandatory overtime project. Victoria had been working undercover for 2 weeks, settling into the strange rhythm of cubicle life, when the air conditioning died with a mechanical wheeze that left the entire 15th floor sweltering in August heat. "Perfect timing," Maria muttered, loosening her collar as she surveyed the department. "The Hartwell presentation is due tomorrow morning, and now we're working in a sauna." The Hartwell account was bigger than Victoria had initially realized. Not the small regional client she'd dismissed from her executive perspective, but a mid-sized company whose contract renewal could significantly impact the department's quarterly numbers. As Vicky the intern, she was seeing it through David's eyes, a career-defining opportunity that could either establish his credibility or confirm Richard's assessment of his inadequacy. "The building maintenance says they can't get parts until Friday," announced Tom Harrison, the department's longest-serving employee. His shirt was already dark with sweat, and it was barely 3 o'clock. Richards emerged from his office, surveying the increasingly uncomfortable department with the expression of a general whose battle plans had been disrupted by weather. "This is unacceptable. The presentation needs to be perfect, and I'm not accepting climate-related excuses for poor performance." Victoria watched several employees exchange glances, the kind of silent communication that develops in dysfunctional families or toxic workplaces. They all knew what this meant. Working through the night in stifling conditions while Richards retreated to his air-conditioned car at 5 o'clock sharp. "Maybe we could work from home," David suggested tentatively. "The presentation files are on the shared server." Richards' laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Remote work is for people who've earned trust, Chin. You haven't reached that level yet." He gestured toward the department. "Everyone stays until this is finished. I don't care if you have to work in your underwear." The casual cruelty of the comment, reducing professional dignity to a punchline, made Victoria's jaw clench. Around the department, she saw people's faces close off, retreating into the careful blankness that served as armor against humiliation. "I'll be checking progress every few hours," Richards continued, adjusting his tie. "Don't disappoint me." By 6 o'clock, the department had been abandoned by everyone except the marketing team. The temperature had climbed to stifling levels, and the usual boundaries of professional distance began to blur under the shared misery of impossible working conditions. "I've got a cooler in my car," Maria announced, returning from the parking garage with ice and bottled water. And I may have stopped by the deli downstairs. She'd brought sandwiches, not expensive catered food, but simple deli sandwiches that she'd clearly paid for herself. Victoria watched this small act of generosity with a mixture of admiration and shame. Here was Maria, earning a fraction of what Victoria spent on a single dinner, taking care of her colleagues with her own resources, while Victoria's company provided nothing. "Maria, you didn't have to," David began. "We're in this together," Maria said simply, distributing water bottles. "Besides, low blood sugar makes everything worse, and we've got a long night ahead." As the evening wore on, the artificial boundaries of workplace hierarchy dissolved in the heat and shared exhaustion. Victoria found herself sitting on the floor between David and Maria, their backs against a cubicle wall, laptops balanced on their knees as they worked on different aspects of the presentation. The fluorescent lights had been dimmed to reduce heat, leaving them working in the blue glow of computer screens. "Tell me about your sister," Maria said to David during a break, her voice gentle with genuine interest. David's face softened. "Emma. She's 16, diagnosed with juvenile arthritis when she was 12. The treatments are," he gestured helplessly, "expensive. But she's incredible, on her roll, wants to be a physical therapist to help other kids like her." Victoria felt something tight and painful in her chest. She'd been calculating David's salary in her head, $32,000 a year, barely enough to cover basic living expenses, let alone medical bills. The insurance her company provided had high deductibles and limited coverage for specialized treatments. David wasn't just working for career advancement, he was working to keep his sister healthy. "What about you, Vicky?" Maria asked. "Family?" Victoria hesitated. The truth was too complicated, too loaded with privilege and pain. "Not much family left," she said finally. "My father and I, we're working on rebuilding our relationship. It's been complicated." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it felt strange to reduce her billion-dollar empire and executive isolation to such simple terms. In this context, sitting on an office floor sharing deli sandwiches, her usual life seemed not just distant, but almost fictional. "Family's hard," David said with unexpected wisdom, "especially when there's hurt involved. But at least you're trying. That counts for something." As they worked deeper into the night, Victoria found herself experiencing something she'd almost forgotten: collaboration without calculation. There was no jockeying for position, no strategic networking, no careful management of image and advantage. Just three people working toward a common goal, supporting each other through shared difficulty. When David's laptop battery died, and he couldn't find his charger, Victoria offered hers without thinking. When Maria's back started cramping from sitting on the floor, they rearranged the workspace to make her more comfortable. When Victoria admitted she was struggling with a design element, David showed her a technique he'd learned in college, patient and encouraging despite his own exhaustion. "You know," David said around midnight, rubbing his eyes as he reviewed layouts for the 100th time, "I never expected this job to be like this." "Like what?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she knew. "The people, I mean. In school, they teach you about corporate culture and team dynamics, but it's all theoretical. I didn't realize how much the environment shapes everything." He glanced toward Richard's empty office. "I didn't know that one person could make an entire department afraid to breathe." Maria made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. 15 years I've been here. I've watched good people leave, seen talented kids like you get crushed before they even had a chance to grow. The work isn't the problem, it's the fear." "Why do you stay?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. "Where else would I go?" Maria's shrug was pragmatic rather than defeated. "I'm 46 with a high school education and 15 years of experience in a company that doesn't value experience. Starting over somewhere else means starting at the bottom with 20-year-olds who have college degrees. At least here, I know the system." The casual acceptance of limited options hit Victoria harder than any boardroom presentation ever had. Maria wasn't lazy or unambitious. She was trapped by circumstances that made risk impossible. Her loyalty to the company wasn't born of satisfaction but of necessity, and Victoria's leadership had done nothing to reward that loyalty with security or growth. "What would you change?" Victoria asked quietly. "If you could change anything about this place?" David and Maria exchanged glances, the careful look of people wondering if honesty was safe. Recognition, David said finally. Not just the big wins, but the daily work. Maybe acknowledgement that we're human beings with lives outside these cubicles. Training, Maria added. Real professional development, not just compliance courses. Investment in people instead of just replacement of people. Basic respect, they said almost simultaneously, then laughed at the synchronicity. Basic respect. Victoria sat with that phrase, turning it over in her mind. It seemed like such a simple thing, treating employees as whole human beings rather than productivity units. But in her experience, corporate leadership often confused respect with reward, assuming that paychecks and benefits were sufficient acknowledgement of human dignity. She thought about her own leadership style, the distance she maintained, the way she relied on metrics rather than relationships, her assumption that professional success naturally translated to personal fulfillment. Had she ever asked her executives about their employees' well-being? Had she ever wondered whether her pursuit of efficiency was grinding away the humanity of the people who made her success possible? By 3 a.m, they'd created something extraordinary. The Hartwell presentation was more than just a marketing proposal. It was a story about family legacy and authentic craftsmanship, told with the kind of emotional resonance that only came from people who understood what it meant to work for something bigger than themselves. This is really good, Maria said, scrolling through the final slides. Hartwell is going to love the family business angle. Assuming Richards doesn't find something to tear apart, David added, but his exhaustion had taken the edge off his anxiety. Victoria looked at the presentation they'd built together. David's creative vision, Maria's strategic insight, her own design contributions, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pride, but not the cold satisfaction of conquest she was used to. This was warmer, more connected. They'd created something meaningful together, and the process had been as valuable as the product. Whatever happens with Richards tomorrow, she said, you should both know that this is exceptional work. You should be proud. As they packed up their laptops and prepared to leave, Victoria realized something had shifted irreversibly in her understanding of leadership. She'd spent 20 years at the top of the pyramid, making decisions that affected thousands of lives, but she'd never truly understood the weight of that responsibility. Tonight, working shoulder to shoulder with David and Maria, she'd glimpsed what leadership could look like when it was grounded in relationship rather than hierarchy. The question now was whether she had the courage to bring that understanding back to the 43rd floor, even if it meant dismantling everything she'd built in service of something more human. Walking to her car in the pre-dawn darkness, Victoria felt the weight of tomorrow's performance review. Richards would evaluate their work through his lens of criticism and control, looking for weaknesses to exploit rather than strengths to build upon. David and Maria would sit in his office, vulnerable and hoping, while a man who'd never learned to see employees as human beings decided their professional fate. For the first time in her corporate career, Victoria Edwards was dreading a meeting she had the power to control. Because now she understood what was at stake. Not just quarterly numbers or client satisfaction, but the dreams and dignity of people who deserved so much better than the leadership they'd been given. The presentation that David, Maria, and Victoria had crafted through the night was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:30, Victoria sat in the bathroom stall, listening to David throw up in the adjacent one. Sorry, his muffled voice came through the thin partition. Nerves. I'll be fine. Victoria's heart clenched. Through the stall door, she could hear the sound of running water, David trying to compose himself for what felt like a professional execution. She wanted to tell him it would be okay, that she had the power to protect him, but Vicky the intern had no such authority. David, she called softly, the presentation is incredible. You know that, right? A pause. Then, thanks, Vicky. I can't afford to mess this up. When they emerged from the bathroom, Maria was waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and the grim expression of someone who'd seen too many good people destroyed by bad management. How are you holding up? She asked David, pressing one of the cups into his trembling hands. Like I'm about to walk into a firing squad, he admitted. Richards is unpredictable, Maria said carefully. Sometimes he's reasonably professional with clients. Sometimes. She trailed off, but they all understood. Sometimes his cruelty overrode his self-interest. Victoria watched this exchange and felt the full weight of her cowardice. Here were two people she'd come to care about, preparing to face judgment from a man whose behavior she'd enabled through years of willful blindness. David was risking his sister's health care, Maria was risking the stability she'd spent 15 years building, and Victoria was hiding behind a false identity, while having the power to stop it all with a single phone call. They walked to Richard's office together, David carrying his laptop like a shield. Through the glass walls, Victoria could see the Hartwell clients already seated, an older man in his 60s with calloused hands and kind eyes, and a younger woman who looked like she might be his daughter. The family business they'd spent all night understanding and honoring was right there, real and vulnerable, and hoping for partnership. Richards gestured for David to begin, his expression already skeptical. Victoria and Maria took seats along the wall, officially present to observe and learn, actually there to provide whatever moral support they could offer. David's voice started shaky, but grew stronger as he moved through the presentation. Victoria watched him transform from nervous intern to passionate storyteller, explaining how Hartwell's commitment to craftsmanship and family values could translate into digital marketing that honored their legacy while expanding their reach. It was beautiful work. The slides flowed seamlessly, the narrative was compelling, and the strategy was both innovative and respectful. The Hartwell clients leaned forward, engaged and clearly impressed. The older man, Robert Hartwell, nodded appreciatively at several points, his daughter taking notes with growing enthusiasm. Victoria felt a surge of protective pride watching David present work they'd created together. This was what leadership should look like, supporting talented people, helping them showcase their best ideas, creating conditions for success rather than failure. Then Richards interrupted. "Excuse me, Chun," he said, his voice cutting through David's explanation of social media strategy. "Can you explain why you've recommended such an aggressive timeline for implementation?" David paused, glancing at his notes. The timeline was actually quite reasonable. Victoria had helped him research industry standards to ensure they weren't overpromising. The phased approach allows Hartwell to test and adjust without overwhelming their current operations, David explained. Industry best practices suggest. Industry best practices? Richard's tone carried barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Hartwell, I apologize, but Mr. Chin here is still learning the difference between textbook theory and real-world application. The timeline he's suggesting would strain our resources and potentially compromise quality." Victoria felt her blood pressure spike. The timeline was perfectly reasonable. She'd reviewed dozens of similar projects from her executive vantage point. Richards wasn't correcting a mistake, he was manufacturing one. Robert Hartwell frowned. "The timeline seemed achievable to me. We're not looking to rush, but we are eager to modernize." "Of course," Richards smiled, the expression sharp and predatory. "What Mr. Chun hasn't factored in is our department's current capacity constraints. We'd need to charge premium rates for that kind of turnaround, which might not align with your budget expectations." Victoria watched David's face pale. This wasn't part of their presentation. Richards was freelancing, apparently trying to either inflate the project cost or make David look incompetent in front of the clients. "Actually," David said, his voice stronger than Victoria expected, "the timeline accounts for normal resource allocation. We wouldn't need to charge premium rates because the work falls within standard project parameters." The silence that followed was loaded with tension. Richard's expression shifted to something dangerous, and Victoria realized David had just committed the cardinal sin of contradicting his manager in front of clients. "I think," Richard said slowly, "we should table the timeline discussion and focus on the creative elements Mr. Chun has prepared." But the damage was done. The collaborative energy in the room had shifted to uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing some kind of power struggle. The Hartwells exchanged glances, clearly picking up on dynamics they didn't understand, but instinctively disliked. David finished the presentation with professional composure, but Victoria could see the cost in the tight line of his shoulders, the careful modulation of his voice. When Robert Hartwell complimented the work and asked about next steps, Richard smoothly took over, positioning himself as the primary contact and relegating David to junior support. After the clients left, Richards closed his office door and gestured for David to sit. Victoria and Maria remained in the outer office, pretending to work while straining to hear the conversation through glass walls that provided visual, but not audio access to the destruction happening inside. They could see Richard's body language, the aggressive lean forward, the jabbing finger, the theatrical gestures of someone performing authority rather than exercising it. David sat motionless, taking each verbal blow with the stillness of someone who'd learned that any response would only make things worse. Victoria's phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Board meeting at 2 p.m. Quarterly review needs your approval. The quarterly review. The same metrics that would show Richard's department exceeding targets, the numbers that justified his continued employment and promotion prospects. Victoria stared at her phone, feeling the weight of her double life. In a few hours, she'd sit in a boardroom and approve reports that validated the systematic destruction of human dignity she was witnessing right now. Through the glass wall, she saw David's shoulders shake. Not with tears. He was too professional, too careful to break down in front of his tormentor. But with the kind of suppressed emotion that came from having your best work twisted into evidence of inadequacy. "I can't watch this anymore," Maria murmured beside her. "What can we do?" Victoria asked, hating herself for the question. She knew exactly what she could do, but it would mean abandoning her cover, revealing the deception she'd built. "Nothing," Maria said bitterly. "That's the problem. We can document it, report it to HR, file complaints that will be investigated by people who care more about liability than justice. Richards has been here 5 years, and his department delivers results. The system protects him, not us." The office door opened, and David emerged with the careful composure of someone holding themselves together through pure will. His face was flushed, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his materials. Richards followed, his expression satisfied in a way that made Victoria feel physically sick. "Next time, Chun, remember your place in client meetings," Richards said loudly enough for the entire department to hear. "Contradicting your supervisor in front of clients is grounds for termination. Consider this your only warning." David's "yes, Manager Richards," was barely audible. As Richards returned to his office, Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Not the careful control she'd maintained for weeks, but something deeper, the last restraint holding back 20 years of suppressed guilt and recognition. She followed David to his cubicle, where he was staring at his computer screen with unseeing eyes. His hands were folded in his lap, trembling with what might have been rage or despair or exhaustion. "David," she said quietly. He looked up, and Victoria saw something in his eyes that she recognized, the particular kind of damage that came from having your reality systematically denied. She'd seen it in her own mirror after her father left, the confusion of being told that abuse was discipline, that cruelty was character building, that your pain was evidence of your weakness rather than their failure. "The presentation was perfect," she said. "What happened in there had nothing to do with your work." "I shouldn't have contradicted him," David said mechanically. "That was stupid. I should have known better." "No." Victoria's voice came out sharper than intended. "You were right about the timeline. You were right about everything. What happened in there was wrong." David looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten that rightness and wrongness still existed as concepts. "It doesn't matter if I was right. It matters that I need this job." Victoria sat heavily in the chair next to his cubicle. Around them, the department hummed with the careful productivity of people pretending they hadn't witnessed public humiliation. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone understood the lesson being taught. Keep your head down. Don't challenge authority. Accept whatever treatment you receive, because the alternative is worse. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Why did you become interested in marketing?" David blinked at the unexpected question. In college, I took a class about storytelling in business. The professor talked about how marketing could help small businesses tell their stories, connect with people who cared about the same things. I liked the idea of helping family businesses like Hartwell reach customers who would appreciate their values. Victoria felt tears threaten. This was why she'd built her company, or why she'd thought she was building it. To create opportunities for talented people to do meaningful work, to help businesses connect with communities, to build something that mattered. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of that purpose, replacing it with the hollow pursuit of metrics and efficiency. That's exactly what you did today, she said. The Hartwells loved the presentation because you understood their story. That's a gift, David. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. For the first time since the meeting, David's expression softened slightly. Thanks, Vicky. I need to be smarter about how I handle Richards. I can't afford to lose this job. Victoria nodded, but inside, she was making a different calculation. David couldn't afford to lose this job, but he also couldn't afford to stay in an environment that was systematically destroying his confidence and potentially his future. Maria couldn't afford to leave, but she also couldn't afford to waste the rest of her career protecting people from leadership that should be protecting them. And Victoria couldn't afford to keep hiding behind her false identity, while the company she'd built crushed the very people who made its success possible. That evening, she sat in her father's living room again, this time without the careful emotional distance she'd maintained during their first reunion. The weight of the day, watching David's humiliation, seeing Maria's resigned pragmatism, feeling her own complicity in every moment of it, had stripped away her usual defenses. You look troubled, her father said, setting down 2 cups of tea with the careful movements of someone conserving limited energy. I've been thinking about what you said, about success without connection. Victoria accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. I think I've built something terrible, Dad. I think I've become someone terrible. Thomas Edwards studied his daughter's face with eyes that held both love and concern. Tell me. And Victoria did. She told him about Richards, about David and Maria, about the discovery that her empire was built on a foundation of systematic cruelty. She told him about the quarterly reports that celebrated efficiency without counting human cost, about her own isolation and the way it had enabled suffering she'd never bothered to see. I could fire him, she said finally. Richards. I could fire him tomorrow. But that doesn't fix the culture I created, the message I sent by caring more about results than people. Her father was quiet for a long moment. You know, he said finally, the night I left you and your mother, I told myself I was protecting you from my failures. I convinced myself that my problems were too big for a little girl to understand, that leaving was somehow noble. He met her eyes. I was wrong. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself from having to be brave enough to change. Victoria felt the truth of his words settle in her chest like a weight. I don't know how to change. I don't know how to be the kind of leader people deserve. Start with one person, her father said gently. Start with truth. The rest will follow. That night, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. Not the careful, strategic decision of a CEO managing risk, but the desperate, necessary decision of someone who'd finally seen the full cost of her cowardice. Tomorrow, she would stop hiding. Tomorrow, she would tell the truth. And whatever came after, whether it destroyed her carefully constructed empire or transformed it into something worthy of the people who'd placed their trust in her, she would face it as herself rather than as the emotionally armored stranger she'd been pretending to be for 20 years. The girl who'd waited by the window for her father to come home was finally ready to stop waiting and start building the world she wished she'd grown up in. The morning after her conversation with her father, Victoria arrived at the office early, before even the security guards had turned on all the lights. She sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and rehearsing conversations she might never have the courage to begin. Start with one person. Start with truth. When she finally made it to the 15th floor, she found David already at his desk, staring at his computer screen with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who hadn't slept. Yesterday's presentation materials were spread across his workspace like evidence of a crime he was trying to solve. You're here early, Victoria said, settling into the cubicle next to his. David looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted. Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about what I should have said differently, how I should have handled Richards better. He gestured helplessly at the presentation slides. Maybe if I'd structured the timeline section differently, or been more deferential when he questioned it. Victoria felt her heart break a little more. David, stop. What happened yesterday wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? His laugh was bitter. I've been here 6 weeks, Vicky. 6 weeks, and I still don't understand the rules. Maria's been trying to teach me, but I keep making the same mistakes. What mistakes? Victoria kept her voice gentle, but she could feel anger building in her chest. Not at David, but at the system that had convinced him his competence was incompetence, his integrity a liability. Caring too much, David said simply. Getting invested in the work instead of just following orders. Thinking that good ideas matter more than hierarchy. He rubbed his eyes. My sister called last night. She got accepted to a summer program for kids with arthritis, physical therapy combined with leadership training. It would be incredible for her, but the cost. He trailed off. How much? Victoria asked before she could stop herself. David looked embarrassed. $3,000, which might as well be $3 million on my salary, especially if I lose this job. He attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She says it's okay, that there will be other opportunities, but I know how much she wants this. Victoria felt something sharp and painful lodge in her throat. $3,000. She'd spent more than that on a single dinner last month, had written checks for art purchases without a second thought. For David, it represented impossible choices, his sister's dreams versus financial security, hope versus pragmatism. Maybe there are scholarships, she suggested weakly. Maybe, David agreed without conviction. I've been researching grants, looking for sponsors. But most programs like this assume family support that just... He gestured around the cubicle farm. That doesn't exist for people like us. Maria arrived then, carrying coffee and the kind of determined cheerfulness that came from years of practice in impossible situations. How are my two favorite insomniacs this morning? Discussing the fundamental unfairness of the universe, David said with forced lightness. Maria studied his face with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to read emotional weather patterns. Rough night. Emma got into that summer program I mentioned, the one in Colorado. Maria's face lit up, then fell as she processed the implications. Oh, David, that's wonderful and terrible at the same time. Pretty much, he agreed. Victoria watched this exchange. The way Maria immediately understood the complex emotions David was navigating, the casual intimacy of people who'd learned to support each other through systemic disappointment. This was what she'd been missing from her executive perch. The daily reality of working families, the constant calculation of dreams against resources, the way hope and heartbreak lived side by side in every paycheck. Tell me about Emma, Victoria said. What's she like? David's face transformed when he talked about his sister. The exhaustion and anxiety melted away, replaced by fierce love and pride. She's incredible. Diagnosed at 12, but she's never let the arthritis define her. Honor roll student, volunteers at the animal shelter, wants to be a physical therapist specifically to help other kids like her. He pulled out his phone, showing Victoria pictures, a girl with David's kind eyes and a smile that radiated resilience. Emma playing with therapy dogs at a hospital, Emma receiving an academic award, Emma hugging David at his college graduation with tears of pride on both their faces. She's the reason I do everything, David continued. Our parents died in a car accident when she was 10. I was 18, just starting college. Social services wanted to put her in foster care, but I convinced them to let me become her guardian instead. Victoria stared at the photos, trying to process what she was hearing. You've been taking care of her since you were 18? Somebody had to, David said simply. She's my family. My only family. Maria was looking at David with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. Part admiration, part heartbreak, part fierce protectiveness. You never told me about your parents, she said softly. David shrugged, suddenly embarrassed by the attention. It's not something that comes up in casual conversation. Hi, I'm David. I'm an orphan raising his disabled sister on an intern's salary. Not exactly great small talk. The casual way he dismissed his own sacrifice made Victoria's chest tight. Here was someone who'd given up his youth, his freedom, probably countless opportunities, to protect his sister. He'd turned down better jobs in other cities because Emma's doctors were here. He'd chosen a degree in marketing partly because it seemed practical, likely to lead to stable employment that could support them both. The summer program, Victoria said carefully. What exactly is it? David's eyes lit up despite his exhaustion. It's incredible. 8 weeks in Colorado, working with physical therapists who specialize in juvenile arthritis. But it's not just medical. They do leadership training, outdoor activities adapted for different mobility levels, career exploration. Emma would come back confident in ways she's never been confident before. And inspired, Maria added gently. She'd see other kids who've built amazing lives despite their challenges. Exactly. David's voice cracked slightly. She tries to hide it, but I know she worries about her future, about whether her arthritis will limit her options. This program could show her that it doesn't have to. Victoria excused herself to the bathroom, locking the stall door behind her and pulling out her phone. It took her 3 minutes to find the program David was describing, the Rocky Mountain Leadership Institute for young people with chronic conditions. The website was filled with testimonials from participants and their families, stories of transformation and empowerment that brought tears to her eyes. $3,000. Such a small amount in the context of her wealth, such an enormous barrier in the context of David's reality. She stared at her phone for a long moment, finger hovering over her assistant's number. She could fix this with a phone call, could anonymously sponsor Emma's participation without David ever knowing where the money came from. It would be simple, clean, require no emotional risk on her part. But her father's words echoed in her mind. Start with truth. When she returned to the cubicle area, David and Maria were deep in conversation about budget spreadsheets and cost-cutting measures, trying to find $3,000 in a financial reality that had no room for such luxuries. What if we organized a fundraiser? Maria was saying. The department could sponsor Emma's participation. David shook his head. I can't ask people to donate their own money for my family. Everyone here is dealing with their own financial pressures. It wouldn't be charity, Maria insisted. It would be community, supporting each other. Victoria listened to this planning session with growing amazement. Here were people with limited resources trying to take care of each other, while she, with unlimited resources, had spent 20 years taking care of no one but herself. What if, Victoria said slowly, there was another way? Both David and Maria looked at her curiously. I mean, Victoria continued, her heart pounding, what if someone in the company, someone with decision-making authority, decided that professional development for employees' families was worth investing in? David's expression was kind but skeptical. That's a nice thought, Vicky, but I don't think Edwards Global Technologies has a family education budget. They barely have a professional development budget for actual employees. The irony of his statement hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her company, which she'd built to be innovative and employee-friendly, was apparently known among its own workforce as stingy with professional development. The gap between her intentions and her impact was wider than she'd imagined. Besides, Maria added pragmatically, even if such a program existed, Richards would never recommend David for it. Not after yesterday. What if someone went over Richards' head? Victoria suggested. And commit career suicide? David laughed, but there was no humor in it. Vicky, I appreciate the optimism, but that's not how things work here. Going over Richards' head means finding yourself on his permanent hit list, and eventually he'd find a way to make you pay for it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the rest of the department, and they scattered to their respective workstations. But throughout the morning, Victoria found herself watching David and Maria navigate their impossible situation with grace and creativity that humbled her. Maria quietly redistributed some of David's workload to protect him from potential criticism, taking on extra tasks herself despite her own deadlines. David threw himself into his assignments with the desperate focus of someone trying to prove their worth, while simultaneously researching scholarship opportunities during his break times. At lunch, the three of them sat in the building's food court, a space Victoria had never visited despite owning the building. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, the tables were plastic, and the food was institutional, but there was something warm about sharing a meal with people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. I've been thinking, Maria said, picking at her salad. My cousin works in nonprofit fundraising. Maybe she could help us organize something for Emma's program. Maria, I can't ask you to, David began. You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference. Victoria watched this exchange with growing understanding. This was what she'd been missing, not just the financial struggles of her employees, but the networks of care they built to survive those struggles. Maria wasn't just David's colleague. She was his chosen family, his safety net, his advocate in a system that seemed designed to grind them both down. What about you, Vicky? Maria asked. Any brilliant fundraising ideas? Victoria hesitated. She could suggest anonymous donations, corporate sponsorships, grant applications. But all of those solutions danced around the real issue, that she had the power to solve this problem immediately, and her reluctance to reveal that power was protecting her comfort at the expense of Emma's opportunity. Actually, she said carefully, I've been thinking about something else. What if we approach this differently? How do you mean? David asked. What if, instead of trying to raise money for one specific program, we tried to address the larger issue? The fact that people working full-time for a successful company shouldn't have to choose between their family's opportunities and their financial security. Maria raised an eyebrow. That's a beautiful sentiment, but it's not exactly actionable. We can't change the entire economic system over lunch. No, Victoria agreed, but we could change how this company supports its employees' families. We could present a business case for why investing in employee family development actually benefits the company's bottom line. David was staring at her with new interest. You've really thought about this? I have, Victoria said, and realized it was true. Not just since this morning, but for weeks now. Watching the daily reality of her employees' lives, seeing the gap between corporate rhetoric and lived experience, understanding finally that sustainable success required investing in the people who made that success possible. The retention rates alone would justify the investment, she continued, warming to the subject. Think about how much it costs to replace and retrain employees versus how much it would cost to provide meaningful support for their families. Maria was nodding slowly. Plus the productivity benefits. People who aren't constantly worried about family finances or opportunities can focus more completely on their work. Exactly, Victoria said. And the recruiting advantages. In a competitive job market, comprehensive family support could be a major differentiator. For the next 30 minutes, they sketched out the framework for a proposal that could revolutionize how Edwards Global Technologies approached employee welfare. David contributed insights about what young professionals actually needed. Maria provided wisdom about what veteran employees valued, and Victoria found herself drawing on 20 years of strategic thinking to create a business case that was both compassionate and compelling. This is actually brilliant, David said as they reviewed their notes. But who would we present it to? Richards would shut it down before we finished the first slide. HR? Maria suggested without much conviction. They're not exactly known for innovative thinking, David replied. Victoria felt the weight of the moment settling around her. Here was her opportunity, not just to help Emma, but to begin transforming the culture she'd accidentally created. She could reveal her identity right now, could promise to implement every idea they'd discussed, could solve their problems with the stroke of a pen. But something held her back. Maybe it was the fear that her revelation would change their relationship, would make them see her as the enemy rather than the ally she was trying to become. Maybe it was the knowledge that real change required more than executive mandate. It required understanding, relationship, trust that couldn't be bought or commanded. What if, she said carefully, we started by documenting everything, creating a comprehensive proposal that was so well-researched and compelling that it would be hard to ignore, regardless of who reviewed it. That could work, Maria said thoughtfully. If we presented it through the proper channels, made it about business benefits rather than personal requests. And if we positioned it as coming from employees who understand both the challenges and the solutions, David added. As they walked back to the department, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warm satisfaction of collaboration toward a meaningful goal. Not the cold pleasure of closing a deal or beating competitors, but the deeper fulfillment that came from working with people you cared about to solve problems that mattered. Thank you, David said quietly as they waited for the elevator. For listening, for caring, for believing this could work. I haven't felt this hopeful about anything really in a long time. Victoria looked at his face, still tired, still worried, but lit up with possibility in a way that made her chest tight with emotion. Thank you for trusting me with Emma's story, for letting me be part of trying to help. As the elevator doors closed, Victoria caught her reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at her was still wearing Target clothing and minimal makeup, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 20 years, she looked like someone she might actually want to know. The proposal they were planning wouldn't just help Emma attend her summer program. It would help Victoria become the kind of leader her employees deserved, the kind of person her father had hoped she could be, the kind of daughter who honored her mother's memory by caring for other people's children the way her mother had cared for her. Start with one person. Start with truth. She was beginning to understand that truth wasn't just about revealing her identity. It was about revealing her heart, about choosing vulnerability over control, about building bridges instead of walls. Tomorrow, she would take the first real step toward becoming the leader she'd always had the power to be. Have you ever experienced the kind of collaboration that makes you feel more hopeful about human nature? When have you seen people with limited resources find ways to take care of each other? Share your thoughts below. The betrayal came disguised as opportunity, wrapped in the cruel efficiency of corporate politics and delivered with Richard's trademark smile. Victoria arrived at work Thursday morning to find David's cubicle empty, his personal items boxed neatly beside his computer. For a moment, her heart stopped. Had he been fired? Had Richards finally found an excuse to eliminate the threat David's competence posed to his authority? "He's upstairs," Maria said quietly, appearing beside Victoria with coffee and the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. Richards called him to the 20th floor first thing this morning. Some kind of special assignment. The 20th floor. Victoria knew it well. It housed the senior management offices, the conference rooms where million-dollar decisions were made, the executive dining room where she'd hosted countless business lunches. It was also where Michael Sterling, the VP of Strategic Development, worked on high-profile client acquisitions. "What kind of special assignment?" Victoria asked, though she was already dreading the answer. Maria's expression was carefully neutral, but Victoria caught the flash of anger in her eyes. Apparently, someone was impressed with David's work on the Hartwell presentation. Sterling requested him specifically for a project that could accelerate his career trajectory. The words sounded positive, but Maria's tone suggested otherwise. Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. "That's good news, right?" "Maybe," Maria said without conviction. "Or maybe it's Richard's way of removing a problem without having to fire anyone. Send David upstairs where he can't cause trouble down here. Let Sterling burn him out on impossible assignments, then bring him back broken or not at all." Through the glass walls of Richard's office, Victoria could see him on the phone, gesturing animatedly with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved an inconvenient problem. He caught sight of her watching and offered a wave that might have been friendly if not for the predatory gleam in his eyes. The morning crawled by without David. His absence created a strange void in the department's energy. Conversations were more muted, productivity felt forced, and Victoria found herself checking the elevator every few minutes, hoping to see his familiar figure emerging with news about his mysterious reassignment. At lunch, Victoria made an executive decision. She took the elevator to the 20th floor, her intern badge granting her access to areas she technically had no business visiting. The executive floors felt different from the working levels: thicker carpets, better lighting, the hushed atmosphere of serious money and power. She found David in a conference room that could have housed the entire marketing department, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial projections that covered every available surface. He was bent over his laptop, typing frantically while simultaneously juggling two phones and a tablet displaying what looked like stock charts. "David," she called softly from the doorway. He looked up with eyes that were wide with panic and exhaustion. "Vicky, what are you doing up here?" "Looking for you. Maria said you'd been reassigned." Victoria stepped into the conference room, taking in the chaos of papers and the smell of stressed sweat that clung to David despite his professional appearance. "Sterling pulled me onto the Morrison Industries acquisition," David said, running his hands through his hair. "It's intense. They want a complete competitive analysis, market positioning study, and integration timeline by tomorrow morning." Victoria felt her blood pressure spike. The Morrison Industries acquisition was a $200 million deal that typically required teams of senior analysts working for weeks. She'd been following it from her executive perspective, knowing it was one of the most complex projects currently on Edwards Global's agenda. "Tomorrow morning," she repeated. "David, that's impossible. Projects like this usually take—" "I know," David interrupted, his voice tight with controlled panic. "But Sterling says it's a test. That if I can prove myself on something this big, it could open doors that might take years to open otherwise. He gestured helplessly at the mountains of data. I can't afford to fail at this, Vicky. Not when Emma's future might depend on the opportunities this could create. Victoria stared at the impossible scope of work spread across the conference table. She knew exactly what this was, not an opportunity but a setup. There was no way one person, regardless of talent or dedication, could complete this analysis in the time frame given. David was being set up to fail spectacularly, publicly, in a way that would justify any future decision to marginalize or terminate him. "Who else is working on this with you?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Just me," David confirmed. "Sterling said he wanted to see what I could accomplish without the crutch of team support." The cruelty of it took Victoria's breath away. This wasn't about testing David's abilities, it was about destroying them. By tomorrow morning, he'd be exhausted, defeated, and holding work product that would inevitably be inadequate through no fault of his own. Sterling could then point to David's failure as evidence that he'd been promoted beyond his capabilities, justifying his return to entry-level work or his dismissal entirely. "David, listen to me," Victoria said urgently. "This isn't a fair test. What they're asking you to do is my job," David finished firmly. "Look, I know it's a lot, but Sterling believes in me enough to give me this chance, and Richards recommended me specifically. Maybe they see something in me that I don't see in myself." Victoria felt something break inside her chest. David's faith in the system, his belief that his supervisors had his best interests at heart, his willingness to blame himself for impossible circumstances, all of it was exactly what she'd once been like, before cynicism and power had taught her to recognize manipulation. "Richards recommended you?" she asked quietly. "Sterling said Richards spoke very highly of my work ethic and potential." David's smile was tired but genuine. "I know we've had our differences, but maybe yesterday's presentation showed him what I'm capable of." The innocent trust in David's voice made Victoria feel physically sick. Richards hadn't recommended David for his potential. He'd recommended him for his destruction. This was punishment for the Hartwell presentation, for David's competence, for the threat his integrity posed to Richards' authority. "How long have you been working on this?" Victoria asked. David checked his watch. "Since 7 this morning. Sterling wants me to work through the night, if necessary, to have everything ready for the board presentation tomorrow. 14 hours of work already, with another 14 ahead of him." Victoria could see the physical toll in David's pale complexion, the tremor in his hands from too much caffeine and stress, the way he blinked too often as if trying to clear vision that was blurring from exhaustion. "You can't do this," she said. "David, you're going to make yourself sick." "I have to do this," David replied, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who felt trapped. "This is my chance, Vicky. Maybe my only chance to prove I belong here, to build the kind of career that could actually support Emma's dreams." Victoria wanted to scream. She wanted to reveal her identity right then, to put an end to this sadistic game, to fire Sterling and Richards and everyone else who thought human beings were expendable resources to be manipulated and discarded. But she could see in David's eyes that he needed to believe this was legitimate, that admitting the truth would destroy more than just his current assignment. It would destroy his faith in his own judgment, his trust in the possibility of fair treatment, his hope that merit and hard work actually mattered. "What if I helped?" she offered. "I could stay and work with you tonight." David's expression softened with gratitude, but he shook his head. "I can't ask you to do that. Besides, Sterling was very specific that this was a solo assignment. If he found out I had help..." Victoria understood. David couldn't risk appearing to violate the terms of his opportunity, couldn't afford to give Sterling any excuse to declare his failure invalid due to outside assistance. As she rode the elevator back to the 15th floor, Victoria felt something dark and ugly growing in her chest. Not just anger at Richards and Sterling, but rage at herself for creating a system where this kind of cruelty was not only possible but profitable. She'd built a company culture that rewarded predators and punished integrity, that measured success by numbers rather than humanity. Maria took one look at Victoria's face when she returned to the department and immediately guided her to the break room. "How bad is it?" Maria asked without preamble. "Worse than we thought," Victoria said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "They've given him an impossible assignment. $200 million acquisition analysis, complete market study, due tomorrow morning. Solo. Maria closed her eyes. Bastards. You knew this would happen? I suspected. Maria's voice was tired, resigned. I've seen this playbook before. Set someone up with an impossible task, then use their inevitable failure to justify whatever you wanted to do to them anyway. It provides cover. We gave him every opportunity, but he just couldn't handle the responsibility. Victoria stared at Maria, seeing 20 years of accumulated wisdom about corporate cruelty, understanding finally that her employees had developed survival skills she'd never needed to learn. How do we stop it? Victoria asked. Maria's laugh was bitter. We don't. That's the point. They hold all the cards, we hold none. David will work himself into the ground tonight, produce something that's inadequate by design, and tomorrow they'll use his failure to justify treating him like he was never worthy of better treatment in the first place. There has to be something. There is, Maria interrupted. We can be here for him when it's over. We can help him pick up the pieces, remind him that his worth isn't determined by their games. We can make sure he knows that what happened to him was wrong, even if we can't prevent it from happening. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of frustrated productivity. Victoria tried to focus on her assigned tasks, but her mind kept drifting to the 20th floor, to David bent over impossible spreadsheets, slowly destroying himself in service of other people's cruelty. At 6 o'clock, most of the department cleared out for the day. Victoria lingered, unwilling to leave while David was still trapped upstairs. Maria stayed too, both of them maintaining a vigil for someone they couldn't save. I keep thinking about Emma, Maria said quietly. About how excited she must be that her brother is working on such an important project. She probably thinks this is the beginning of something wonderful for their family. Victoria felt tears threaten. Emma, who David protected so fiercely, who believed in her brother's ability to build a better life for both of them, who had no idea that her champion was being systematically destroyed by people who saw his love for her as weakness to be exploited. At 8 o'clock, Victoria made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She couldn't reveal her identity. Not yet, not when David needed to believe in the legitimacy of his opportunity. But she could go home to her penthouse, could use her executive access to pull the data David needed, could create the analysis that would save him from failure. It would be simple. She could compile the Morrison Industries report overnight, slip it to David anonymously, let him submit work that would actually meet Sterling's standards. He'd never know where it came from, would credit his own exhaustion-fueled brilliance, and the crisis would pass without anyone discovering her deception. But as Victoria sat in her car, phone in hand, ready to call her research team, she realized the fundamental flaw in her plan. Saving David this way wouldn't protect him. It would only delay the inevitable. Sterling and Richards would find another impossible task, another opportunity for public failure, another way to justify their predetermined conclusion that David didn't belong. Worse, it would rob David of the clarity that might come from seeing the system's true nature. If she rescued him now, he'd continue believing that merit mattered, that working harder was the solution, that the problem was his inadequacy rather than their malice. Victoria put her phone away and drove home through streets that blurred with tears she couldn't shed, carrying the weight of a choice that felt like betrayal no matter what she decided. Tomorrow, David would fail. Tomorrow, his faith in fairness would be shattered. Tomorrow, Emma would learn that her brother's sacrifice hadn't been enough to protect them from a world that saw their love as liability. And Victoria would watch it happen, knowing she had the power to prevent it, knowing that preventing it might ultimately cause more harm than letting the truth reveal itself in all its ugly clarity. That night, she sat in her penthouse office, staring at the Morrison Industries file on her computer screen, holding David's professional future in her hands, and paralyzed by the knowledge that every choice available to her felt like a different kind of betrayal. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She would let David fail. She would let him see the system's true face. And then, when his illusions were shattered and his eyes were finally open, she would reveal herself and begin the work of building something worthy of his trust. It was the hardest choice she'd ever made, and she wasn't sure she'd ever forgive herself for making it. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She paced her penthouse office like a caged animal, watching the city lights blur through tears she couldn't shed while David worked himself toward destruction 43 floors below. Every hour, she picked up her phone to call her research team, to summon the resources that could save him. Every hour, she set it down again, her father's words echoing in her mind. The hardest thing about being powerful is remembering that other people are real. David was real. His exhaustion was real. His faith in a system designed to break him was heartbreakingly, devastatingly real. And Victoria's choice to let him discover that truth the hard way felt like the cruelest thing she'd ever done. At 5 a.m., she gave up pretending she might sleep and dressed for work. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal, each floor a countdown to David's professional execution. When the doors opened, she found the marketing department dark and empty, except for the security lights casting long shadows across the cubicle maze. But the 20th floor, that would be different. David would still be there, still fighting the impossible fight, still believing that determination could overcome institutional cruelty. Victoria took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the physical pain of 20 flights to match the ache in her chest. By the time she reached the executive level, her legs were shaking and her breath came in sharp gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. The conference room where she'd left David looked like a war zone. Papers covered every surface, multiple laptops hummed with overheated processors, and empty coffee cups formed a sad monument to 18 hours of desperate productivity. David sat hunched over the main table, his shirt wrinkled and stained, his hair disheveled, his hands trembling as he typed with the mechanical persistence of someone running on fumes and terror. "David," Victoria said softly from the doorway. He looked up with eyes that were bloodshot and unfocused, blinking several times before recognizing her. "Vicky? What time is it?" 5:30. In the morning. David stared at her for a moment, processing this information with the delayed reaction of severe exhaustion. "I didn't realize. I thought it was still." He gestured vaguely at the windows, where dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. "I lost track." Victoria stepped into the conference room, taking in the scope of work David had attempted. Spreadsheets covered every table, financial projections were taped to the walls, and his laptop screen showed a presentation with nearly 200 slides, far more than any reasonable analysis would require, but nowhere near the comprehensive study Sterling had demanded. "How much have you completed?" she asked gently. David laughed, a sound that might have been hysteria if it hadn't been so tired. "I don't know. Maybe 60%? 70? I keep finding more data that needs to be included, more angles I haven't considered. Every time I think I'm done, I realize I've missed something crucial." He was trapped in the perfectionist's nightmare. The more he worked, the more he understood how much work remained. Victoria recognized the spiral from her own early career, the crushing realization that some tasks were designed to be impossible rather than challenging. "When is the presentation?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. 9 a.m. Sterling moved it up from 10:30. David rubbed his eyes with hands that shook from too much caffeine and stress. He said the board's schedule had changed, that this was my chance to prove I could adapt to last-minute pressures. Of course he had. Another manipulation, another way to ensure David's failure while maintaining plausible deniability. Victoria felt rage building in her chest, not the cold anger of business competition, but the hot fury of someone watching a loved one being tortured. "David, you need to listen to me," she said, sitting down across from him. "This isn't about your abilities. This assignment, it's not fair. It's not reasonable. It's not designed for you to succeed." David's expression shifted from exhaustion to confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean Sterling and Richards set you up. This isn't an opportunity, it's a trap. They gave you an impossible timeline for an impossible scope of work, knowing you'd fail, so they could justify whatever they want to do to you next." For a moment, David just stared at her. Then he shook his head slowly. No, that doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? If they wanted to get rid of me, they could just fire me. Because this way they get to fire you for cause. This way, you blame yourself instead of them. This way, they look reasonable and you look incompetent. Victoria leaned forward, trying to make him understand. "David, I've seen this before. The timeline, the scope, the last-minute changes. It's all calculated to ensure failure." "You're wrong," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sterling believes in me. He said I had potential, that this was my chance to prove myself. When did he say that? Before or after Richards recommended you for this assignment? David's face went pale. What does that matter? It matters because Richards doesn't recommend people for opportunities. He recommends them for elimination. Think about it, David. After the Hartwell presentation, after you contradicted him in front of clients, suddenly he's your biggest advocate? Suddenly he's telling Sterling you're ready for major responsibilities. Victoria watched understanding dawn in David's eyes. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in his faith in the system's fairness. But the work, David said desperately. I've been doing good work. The analysis is solid, the research is thorough. The work is excellent, Victoria agreed. But it doesn't matter. They're not evaluating your work, they're evaluating your failure. And when you walk into that boardroom in 3 hours with an incomplete analysis, they'll focus on what's missing, not what's there. David stared at the mountains of paper surrounding him, 20 hours of his life reduced to evidence of inadequacy. I can finish it, he said quietly. I just need a few more hours. You need a few more weeks, Victoria corrected gently. Maybe months. David, what you've accomplished in one night would normally take a team of senior analysts working for weeks. The fact that you've gotten this far is remarkable, not shameful. But it's not enough. It was never going to be enough. That's the point. They sat in silence for several minutes, David processing the destruction of his faith in institutional fairness, while Victoria grappled with the weight of her revelation. She'd spent 20 years building a company culture that enabled this kind of systematic cruelty, and now she was watching one of its victims discover the truth in real time. What am I supposed to do? David asked finally. If you're right, and I'm not saying you are, but if you're right, what are my options? Walk away. Quit before they can fire me. You could fight back, Victoria suggested quietly. With what? I'm an intern, Vicky. I have no leverage, no allies, no resources. Fighting back is a luxury for people who can afford to lose. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Here was the fundamental flaw in her understanding of power. She'd always assumed that justice was a matter of will, that good people could overcome institutional corruption through determination and integrity. But David was good people, and determination hadn't protected him. Integrity had made him a target rather than a shield. What about Emma? Victoria asked. What do you tell her when this is over? David's face crumpled slightly. I don't know. She's so proud of me, so excited about this opportunity. How do I explain that I wasn't good enough? That I failed when it mattered most? You didn't fail, Victoria said fiercely. They failed you. They failed everyone who believes in merit and fairness, and the idea that working hard should be enough. Does it matter? David's voice was hollow with exhaustion and disillusionment. The outcome is the same either way. Emma doesn't get her summer program. I probably lose my job, and we're back to choosing between her medical care and basic necessities. Victoria pulled out her phone, finger hovering over her assistant's number. She could end this right now. One phone call, and Sterling would be fired before the board meeting. Another call, and David would be promoted to a position where his talents were valued. A third call, and Emma's summer program would be funded along with every other family development initiative they'd discussed yesterday over lunch. But she could see in David's face that he wasn't ready for salvation from above. He needed to walk through this fire himself, needed to see the system's true face before he could trust alternative. Rescuing him now would make her feel better, but wouldn't address the fundamental problem that had created this situation. The board meeting is in 3 hours, David said, checking his watch with the mechanical movement of someone going through familiar motions. I should try to clean up the presentation, make it as strong as possible. David, I know what you're thinking, he interrupted, that I'm setting myself up for humiliation, that I should just accept defeat. But I can't do that. Even if you're right about everything, even if this is a setup, I have to try. Because if I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I gave up too easily. Victoria understood. David needed to fight this battle, needed to discover his own strength and limits, needed to choose his own response to institutional betrayal. Her role wasn't to save him, but to witness his courage, to make sure he didn't face the aftermath alone. What do you need? She asked. Coffee, David said with a tired smile. And maybe someone to tell me I'm not crazy for believing I could do this. You're not crazy, Victoria said firmly. You're brave, and talented, and worthy of so much better than what this place has given you. For the next 2 hours, Victoria sat with David as he polished his presentation. She watched him transform raw data into compelling narrative, watched him create insights that would have impressed executives with decades more experience, watched him build something beautiful from impossible circumstances. At 8:45, David gathered his materials with the careful precision of someone preparing for battle. His hands had stopped shaking, his voice was steady, and his eyes held the clear determination of someone who'd accepted the stakes. Whatever happens, he said to Victoria, thank you for sitting with me, for believing in the work even when I couldn't. Victoria felt tears threaten. Whatever happens, remember that your worth isn't determined by their judgment. Remember that Emma is proud of you no matter what. Remember that some of us see exactly who you are and know you're extraordinary. David nodded, straightened his tie, and walked toward the boardroom where his professional future would be decided by people who'd already written the ending. Victoria remained in the conference room, surrounded by the evidence of David's heroic effort, and made a choice that would define the rest of her life. When this meeting was over, when David's faith in the system was finally completely shattered, she would reveal herself. Not as his savior, but as his ally. Not to fix what had been broken, but to build something new from the pieces. She pulled out her phone and began typing a resignation letter addressed to herself, effective immediately, for managers Sterling and Richards. Tomorrow, David would walk into a different company with different leadership. Tomorrow, Emma would have her summer program, and David would have a future worthy of his sacrifice. But first, David had to discover his own strength in the face of institutional betrayal. First, he had to choose who he would become when the system revealed its true nature. First, he had to walk through the fire and emerge on the other side, transformed by truth rather than rescued from it. The boardroom was waiting. Victoria's employees were about to discover what she'd been protecting them from and what she'd been complicit in creating. The choice was no longer whether to reveal her identity. It was who she would choose to be when the masks finally came off. Have you ever had to watch someone you care about face an unfair situation, knowing that rescuing them might prevent them from developing their own strength? What do you think builds more character, being saved from difficult truths or discovering them yourself? Share your thoughts. Sometimes love means standing with someone through the storm rather than trying to shield them from it. The boardroom fell silent as David finished his presentation. For 37 minutes, he had delivered the most compelling analysis Victoria had ever witnessed, transforming 20 hours of desperate work into a masterpiece of strategic thinking that would have impressed Fortune 500 executives. His voice never wavered, his insights were brilliant, and his recommendations were both innovative and practical. Victoria watched from the back of the room, having slipped in during the opening remarks. Around the mahogany table sat 12 members of Edwards Global's senior leadership, including Sterling, Richards, and the board members who would ultimately decide David's fate. Their faces revealed nothing, but Victoria could read the room with 20 years of experience in corporate theater. They weren't evaluating David's work. They were waiting for him to finish, so they could deliver the verdict they'd already written. "Thank you, Mr. Chin," Sterling said when David closed his laptop. That was comprehensive. The word hung in the air like a blade. Not brilliant, not insightful, not exceptional, comprehensive. A neutral term that revealed nothing while preparing the ground for criticism. "I'm sure the board has questions," Sterling continued, his smile sharp with predatory anticipation. "Perhaps we could start with the market penetration analysis in Section 4? Victoria felt her heart sink. Section 4 was the weakest part of David's presentation. Not because his analysis was flawed, but because the data he'd needed for complete market penetration modeling was proprietary information that required senior-level access to obtain. David had done remarkable work with public information, but Sterling was about to expose the gaps that existed by design. "Of course," David said, pulling up the relevant slides. His confidence was still intact, but Victoria could see the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For the next 20 minutes, the board systematically dismantled David's presentation. Not through legitimate criticism of his methodology or conclusions, but through questions that required information he'd never been given access to, analysis that would have taken teams of researchers months to complete, and insights that assumed 20 years of industry experience he didn't possess. David answered each question with increasing desperation, his earlier confidence crumbling as he realized the scope of what he didn't know, couldn't know, had never been positioned to know. Victoria watched his face cycle through confusion, frustration, and finally the dawning recognition that he'd been set up to fail. "I think," Richards said with false sympathy, "this demonstrates the difference between academic theory and real-world application. Mr. Chun has certainly put in effort, but the gaps in strategic thinking are concerning for someone we'd consider for senior responsibilities." David's hands were trembling now, his careful composure dissolving under the weight of public humiliation. "I understand the limitations in my analysis," he said quietly, "but given the timeline and available resources—" "There are always constraints, Mr. Chun," Sterling interrupted smoothly. "The mark of senior leadership is the ability to deliver exceptional results despite those constraints. Perhaps this assignment was premature for someone at your experience level." Victoria felt something break inside her chest. Not crack, completely shatter. David sat at that table like a defendant being convicted of crimes he'd never committed, accepting responsibility for failures that were designed by his judges. The same system that had made her wealthy and powerful was destroying someone whose only crime was believing it might be fair. She stood up. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the boardroom's manufactured disappointment. "I'd like to say something." 12 faces turned toward her, with varying degrees of confusion and irritation. Victoria Edwards, CEO and founder, wasn't supposed to be in this room. More importantly, Vicky Edwards, marketing intern, had no authority to interrupt senior leadership meetings. "I'm sorry," Sterling said with patronizing patience, "but this is a closed meeting. Perhaps you could—" "My name is Victoria Edwards," she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority she'd spent 20 years developing. "I'm the founder and CEO of this company, and I've been working undercover in the marketing department for the past month." The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling's face went white, Richards looked like he might vomit, and several board members began frantically checking their phones as if seeking confirmation of an impossible claim. David stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, his mind struggling to reconcile the intern he'd shared coffee and midnight work sessions with the billionaire who controlled his professional fate. "For the past month," Victoria continued, "I've watched this company systematically destroy the humanity and dignity of its employees. I've seen managers who mistake cruelty for leadership, who confuse fear with respect, who believe that breaking people down is the same as building them up." She walked to the front of the room, her target blazer and modest makeup incongruous with the authority radiating from her voice. "Mr. Chen's presentation is extraordinary," she said, gesturing toward David's slides. "In 20 hours, working alone, he produced strategic analysis that would normally require teams of senior consultants working for months. The fact that you're criticizing gaps in proprietary data access and industry connections is like criticizing a swimmer for getting wet." Richards cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Edwards, if we'd known you were conducting some kind of evaluation, you would have acted differently?" Victoria's voice was sharp with contempt. "You would have treated David with respect if you'd known I was watching? You would have been professional and supportive if you'd thought it might matter to your career." The accusation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Around the table, senior executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing that weeks or months of their behavior had been witnessed by someone with the power to end their careers. "David," Victoria said, turning to face him directly, "I owe you an apology. I've been lying to you about who I am, and I let you walk into this meeting knowing it was designed to destroy you. I told myself I was protecting your dignity by letting you fight your own battles, but really I was protecting my own comfort by avoiding difficult truths." David's expression was cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been betrayal. You're really the CEO?" "I am. And everything you've experienced here, the toxic management, the impossible standards, the systematic cruelty, that's my responsibility. I built a culture that rewarded predators and punished integrity, and then I hid from the consequences while good people like you paid the price." Victoria turned back to the board, her voice carrying 20 years of accumulated authority. "Effective immediately, Mr. Sterling and Mr. Richards are terminated. Their severance packages are revoked, Their stock options are forfeit, and they are banned from Edwards' global property. Security will escort them out within the hour. Sterling's face had gone from white to red. You can't just, this is highly irregular. There are procedures. I'm the founder and majority shareholder, Victoria said coldly. I can terminate anyone, at any time, for any reason. Your reason is systematic harassment of employees and willful destruction of human dignity. Consider yourselves fortunate that I'm not pursuing criminal charges for creating a hostile work environment. She turned to the remaining board members, most of whom looked like they were watching a natural disaster unfold in real time. We're going to rebuild this company's culture from the ground up, Victoria announced. Starting with comprehensive family support programs, professional development initiatives that actually develop people instead of breaking them, and management training that focuses on building human beings up instead of tearing them down. David raised his hand tentatively, still processing the revelation that his fellow intern was actually his ultimate boss. Ms. Edwards, what about my assignment? The Morrison Industries analysis. Victoria smiled, not the sharp, predatory expression she'd perfected in 20 years of corporate warfare, but something warmer, more genuine. Your analysis was exceptional, David. The Morrison Industries acquisition is approved based on your recommendations. Congratulations on completing your first major strategic project. But the gaps, the missing data, were inevitable given the constraints you were working under. Any consulting firm would have taken 6 months and charged $2 million for work of comparable quality. Victoria's voice softened. You didn't fail, David. The system failed you, and I failed you by creating that system. She turned to address the entire room. From now on, employee development opportunities will be designed for success, not failure. Timelines will be reasonable, resources will be adequate, and support will be genuine. Anyone who confuses sadism with leadership will find themselves looking for employment elsewhere. The boardroom erupted in whispered conversations and frantic note-taking as executives tried to process the implications of Victoria's revelation. But she only had eyes for David, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. David, she said quietly, I know you have questions. I know you probably feel deceived and manipulated. You have every right to be angry with me. David was quiet for a long moment, considering. I am angry, he said finally. But not because you lied about who you were. I'm angry because you let me believe I wasn't good enough. I'm angry because you watched me tear myself apart trying to meet impossible standards when you could have stopped it with a word. Victoria nodded, accepting the criticism she deserved. You're right. I told myself I was protecting your dignity by letting you fight your own battles, but really I was protecting myself from having to admit how broken the system I'd created really was. But, David continued, I'm also grateful. Because now I know. Now I understand that the problem wasn't my inadequacy, it was their cruelty. And I know that because I lived through it, not because someone rescued me from it. Around them, the boardroom was slowly emptying as Sterling and Richards were escorted out by security, and other executives fled to their offices to begin damage control. But Victoria only cared about the conversation happening between her and the young man whose courage had forced her to confront her own cowardice. There's something else, Victoria said. Your sister Emma, the summer program in Colorado. David's eyes sharpened with protective alertness. What about it? Edwards Global Technologies is establishing a comprehensive family development fund. Emma will be our first recipient, with full funding for the program plus additional support for her future educational needs. David stared at her, tears forming in his eyes. Why? Because you feel guilty? Because she deserves it, Victoria said simply. Because you deserve a job where your love for your family is seen as strength, not weakness. Because I want to build a company where people like you don't have to choose between supporting their loved ones and pursuing their dreams. The tears spilled over then, and David wiped them away with shaking hands. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me fix this place, Victoria said. Say you'll work with me to build something worthy of the people who trusted us with their futures. David looked around the boardroom, at the evidence of power structures that had seemed immutable an hour ago, now revealed as fragile constructs that could be dismantled and rebuilt by people with the courage to imagine something better. What would that look like? He asked. Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in 20 years. I don't know yet. But I know it starts with listening to people like you and Maria, people who understand both the problems and the solutions. I know it means measuring success by how we treat people, not just how much money we make. And I know it means building a company where kindness is seen as strength, where vulnerability is valued, where people can be fully human without fear. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the same boardroom, but everything had changed. The walls displayed employee recognition awards instead of stock price charts. The table was surrounded not just by executives, but by representatives from every level of the company. And at the head of the table sat David Chun, newly promoted to Director of Employee Development, presenting the quarterly Human Impact Report with the same passion he'd once brought to impossible assignments. Employee satisfaction is up 47%, David was saying, his voice confident and strong. Retention has improved by 60%, and productivity metrics show sustained improvement across all departments. But more importantly, exit interviews show that people are leaving for positive reasons: promotions, new opportunities, life changes, rather than fleeing toxic conditions. Victoria listened with pride as David outlined the transformation they'd achieved together. The Family Development Fund had grown to support dozens of employees' children and spouses. Management training now focused on emotional intelligence and human development. And toxic behaviors that had once been rewarded were now grounds for immediate termination. "There's one more thing," David said, clicking to his final slide. "We received a letter this week from Emma Chun, my sister, and the first recipient of our Family Development Fund." Victoria felt tears threaten as David read Emma's letter aloud, a 16-year-old's eloquent description of how the summer program had changed her life, how she'd discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, how she was planning to study business so she could help other companies become more human. "She wants to work here someday," David finished, his voice thick with emotion. "She says Edwards Global Technologies is proof that businesses can be successful and kind at the same time." After the meeting, Victoria and David walked through the marketing department, now humming with collaborative energy instead of fearful productivity. Maria, promoted to department manager, waved from her office where she was mentoring a new group of interns with patience and genuine investment in their success. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked as they reached Victoria's office, relocated to the 15th floor, closer to the people who made the company run. "Giving up the ivory tower, getting involved in the messy human side of business?" Victoria thought about the question seriously. She'd given up the isolated power of her executive perch, the cold satisfaction of distance and control. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: the warm fulfillment of relationships built on mutual respect, the deep satisfaction of using privilege to lift others up, the joy of building something that honored both success and humanity. "The only thing I regret," she said finally, "is waiting so long to come down from that tower. I wasted 20 years hiding from the world when I could have been helping to heal it." As the sun set over the city, Victoria Edwards, CEO, daughter, friend, looked out her window at the world she'd once tried to control from above. Now she was part of it, connected to it, responsible to it in ways that made her wealth and power feel like tools for service rather than walls for protection. Her father had been right. Success without connection was just an elaborate way of hiding from the world. But connection with purpose? That was the foundation for building something that mattered, something that would outlast quarterly reports and stock prices, something worthy of the trust placed in it by people like David and Maria and Emma, people whose dreams deserved leaders brave enough to see them as more than human resources, people whose lives had taught her the most important lesson of all, that true power comes not from rising above others, but from lifting them up alongside you. Looking back on this story, what do you think Victoria's greatest transformation was? From rich to understanding, from isolated to connected, or from hidden to authentic? Have you ever had an experience that completely changed how you see success or power? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us back to our own humanity.